Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. I'm Derek Anderson, President of Jacobus Vanderveer House Commission. JVH would like to thank our co-sponsor of this event, the Historical Society of Somerset Hills, which is headquartered in Basking Ridge. Its chairman is Sue Zabelli. I hope I did that correctly. And President Leslie Brown Witt are here today. Immediately following this talk, we will be hosting a reception at Jacobus Vanderveer House. We invite you to go there right after we talk. You'll be able to meet and speak with the speaker at the reception, so please hold your questions until then. We are also looking forward to the dedication of our new cannon being donated to JVH and a behind-the-scenes look at the artifacts from the Pluckerman Cantonment site. We're very fortunate to have with us two noted historians who are helping us celebrate not only America's 250th birthday, but also General Henry Knox's birthday. Birthdays are always a good day, which is today. They will be taking us back to the 1700s and the Continental Army's presence right here in Somerset Hills. Dr. John Seidel is known to many of you as a lead archaeologist during the excavation of the Pluckerman Artillery Cantonment site in the 1980s. That is the topic of his talk today. Dr. Seidel comes to us from Maryland, where he is currently CEO of the historic St. Mary's City in St. Mary's City, Maryland, one of the country's premier historic 17th century sites. The St. Mary's City Commission is an independent state agency, an 835-acre living history and archaeological museum at the site of Maryland's first capital, dated 1634 to 1695. Dr. Seidel has received his MAS and PhD from the University of Pennsylvania after completing his undergraduate studies at Drew University. Dr. Seidel grew up in the Middle East and has lived and worked in 9 countries. His academic research includes work in the Near East, investigations of the ancient and modern Maya, Guatemalan, and Belize marine research conducted for the U.S. National Park Service, the terrestrial and marine archaeology throughout the eastern U.S., has taught at Rutgers University, the University of Maryland, College Park, Washington College, and St. Mary's College of Maryland. He has published more than 80 articles, books, chapters, and research monographs, and he actively lectures to public and professional groups. Our next speaker would be Barry Thompson. Following his career as a senior officer of a multinational corporation in New York, Barry Thompson turned his attention to architectural and local history. He has become known as many of you through his frequent lectures and written works on those topics. He has co-authored with the late Jack Turpin of one of the 2 volumes of work, New Jersey Country Houses, Somerset Hills, and has written articles on various aspects of history that have appeared in the Black River Journal and other publications. For many years, he has also volunteered his services as a history consultant for many of the Mansions in May fundraising projects sponsored by the Women's Association of Morristown Medical Center. Barry was born and raised in Peapack, Gladstone, where his family has deep roots. He's received his undergraduate education at Drew University in Madison and later studied architecture at urban planning at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. During his corporate career, Barry has honored to be named a David Rockefeller Fellow by the Partnership for New York City, and he has served as director, trustee, and officer of a number of non-for-profit organizations in the city of New Jersey. He is proud to have been the executive producer of 2 documentary films, one promoting the employment of people with developmental disabilities, which was narrated by James Earl Jones, and one about the making of Martin Luther King mural in Washington, D.C. Public Library. I now turn it over to John Seidel.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that
fulsome bio. I appreciate that. I'm pleased to be with you today. Thank you so much to the Commission and to the Historical Society and the Township of Bedminster for inviting me here. I really love coming back here. It's always sort of a trip to old haunts, which makes life fun. But what I'm going to do today is a little bit different than what I normally do. Some of you may have seen a presentation on this in the past, whether at the Middlebrook Symposium or elsewhere. Today is Henry Knox's 276th birthday. He was born on July 25th, and I thought in honor of the general, what we would do is focus a little bit on him, what his background was, what drew him to this area and resulted in this absolutely amazing achievement in 1778-79, and then also where he went from there, because I think he's a vastly underestimated figure in our national history. And I think that he's not been done justice. So I'm going to try and remedy a little bit of that today. So Knox was born in Boston in 1750. His father was a shipwright who ran into financial trouble and went bankrupt and promptly absconded. So he was left with his mother and his younger brother, William. And at 9 years old, he became the breadwinner for the family. He'd been in a Latin school, which was very highly thought of in Boston, was doing excellent work, but he had to go to work for a living. Fortunately for him and for us, he went to work in a bookstore. And those owners invited him to read, to take books home with him, which he did. And then eventually, what he did was to establish his own bookstore, the London Bookstore, which became famous. He had a lot of interaction with British officers, with the higher elements of society in Boston, and it served him well in the future. At the same time, it's really interesting to me because I didn't understand this side of Henry Knox. He was a big, strong young man, and he got involved in fights, in street fights. He became a member, I guess he was an early Southie, because there were two gangs in Boston at the time, North and South, and he was a member of the South gang. He got involved in a lot of these things, and he developed a reputation as one of the best brawlers in Boston. So you got this strange contrast, right? This bookworm who's also a street fighter and a brawler and a member of a gang. So he's got multiple dimensions to him. He happened to be, by happenstance, at the Boston Massacre when it occurred, when people were pelting British soldiers with ice balls and they returned fire. Several people were killed. It went to court. John Adams was one of the attorneys in that. Henry Knox was brought forward as a witness. By all the accounts of the time, he tried to stop the violence. He tried to stop the riot before it got underway, but was unsuccessful in doing so. But this is a catalyst in some ways. It's a catalyst for him, but also for many other people in Boston as well. It's clear to them that these British troops who are here are going to be something they're going to have to contend with. Already Knox had served in Paddock's artillery in Boston, where he started to learn the trade of artillery. Can we minimize the thing on the there for just a minute? It'll get in the way of some of these slides. And then after the massacre, Knox was a co-founder of a group called the Boston Grenadier Corps. Grenadier are shock troops. You take the largest, most fearsome guys in a regiment, and they become grenadiers. They're one of the flank companies, and then you also have smaller, agile guys who are light infantry. Knox was founding this Grenadier Corps. And part of what he was doing, and now my thing is not fast forwarding. It's interesting. What is going on with that? Give me a moment, folks. Go to the back of the machine. We're still not getting anything. This could be interesting. Can I borrow your mouse?
Sure.
Will think like this never happens. There we go. Okay. At the same time, Knox was an avid reader, and he read all of the military treaties of the day. And as these troops came into Boston, the officers wanted something to do, so not just light fare for reading, but also some of the scientific stuff. And Knox was really voracious reader, and some of these titles that you see here become important later on. He has a knowledge of the literature, he absorbs it, and he becomes very competent with all of this. But he also finds the time to get married. He married a woman named Lucy Flucker. The Flucker family were prominent Tories. I think her father was the royal secretary to the province. This did not go well. And in fact, once the conflict broke out, the Flucker family left. They went back to England. Lucy was left adrift, basically disowned by the family. Later on, inherited some land, which turned out to stand Knox in good stead. They had 13 children, 3 of whom reached adulthood. So it was a series of tragedies over time that this couple had to contend with. But nevertheless, they stuck it out. The British in Boston were a prominent presence, all of these ships, and gradually that presence increased. We all know the story of Lexington and Concord. When Lexington and Concord broke out, militiamen flocked from all of New England to Boston, essentially encircled it. And in addition, as Washington was appointed commander-in-chief, additional troops came up from Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania, many of them riflemen like the people that you see right here. And so there was a huge group of men that congregated on Boston, and they started to form these fortifications. That Boston Neck is right here. The town proper is surrounded by water. There are fortifications over here. This is Breed Hill and Bunker Hill. There are fortifications there, and then all the way around. Most of these were designed by Knox, it appears. So Knox was not just a gunner and a street fighter, but he was also an engineer. And then very quickly, because he had done such a wonderful job putting up these fortifications, Washington saw something in him. He was a colonel, he appointed him a colonel, and then he sent him to Fort Ticonderoga, which was a British fort up in the Lake Champlain area that Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold had seized. So they captured this fort full of artillery. That artillery was desperately needed in Boston, and Knox was assigned to go get it. He went all the way across the state, up into New York, grabbed these pieces of guns, so 59 pieces of artillery weighing 60 tons or so, and then he had to move them all the way down those lakes, down those rivers, across the Berkshires in the winter. It was actually easier in the winter because they could slide them on sledges, but it took about 2 months to do. It was a really large undertaking. Once he got them to Boston, though, it was a game changer because overnight, on March 4th, the Americans are starting to fortify Dorchester Heights, which is this area that you see right here, which is a height that overlooks Boston Harbor and all of the British shipping, and it makes that completely untenable. The morning comes, the sun comes up, Howe looks up on this hillside at these heights and he says, wow, these guys have really done a job. My God, these fellows have done more work in one night than my army can do in 3 months. It was a real shock and a real surprise. As a result, the British evacuated Boston. It was one of the first major successes of the American army in many ways. Now, what I want to do here is compress history for a little bit, because we're talking about 1776. The British leave Boston, and we don't know where they're going to go. It turns out they go up to Halifax, and then they decide to head for New York. New York is a key. It is at the mouth of the Hudson. The Hudson is a physical barrier that can separate New England from the lower states. It is a commercial hub as well, and therefore it makes all kinds of sense for the British to attack it. Washington knew this was coming, and he positioned his troops in the city on Long Island and on Manhattan proper, and then on the Jersey side as well. They were not very successful. Knox laid out a lot of the fortifications, but imagine trying to defend an island against one of the greatest navies in the world with amphibious, assault troops. It was just an untenable situation. They were trying to defend it for political reasons, but it was not practical. And as a result, the Americans left. They were then ignominiously chased all the way across New Jersey, crossed the Delaware, and ended up in Pennsylvania. And in December, as Christmas and the New Year approached, the American enlistments were ending. He was about to lose his army completely. And instead, what he did was to turn on the attack. And he crossed the river in the middle of the night on Christmas Day and surprised the Hessians in Trenton, defeated them, and then went back through New Jersey and took New Jersey back. Just like that. It was an amazing turnaround, and it gave the Americans hope. So it was a really, really significant victory. The British then have to figure out what to do next. So the next year, they go down to Philadelphia. They don't go the direct route. They go all the way down to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, sail north up the Chesapeake Bay with Maryland and Virginia on either side. They go to the head of the Chesapeake, and then they march across land and eventually capture Philadelphia. They're at Philadelphia for the winter of 1777-78. That's the winter of Valley Forge. That's the horrible story that we have all heard about, where the Americans suffered greatly for a want of supply and because of the really, really bad weather. But what's key is that during the intervening time period, the French entered the war on our side. This now was a global conflict. It was a world war, if you will. And the British had some very difficult decisions to make. They had very lucrative holdings in the Caribbean, Barbados, Jamaica, sugar plantations. They had to defend them against the French. So they start reapportioning their troops. They send troops to other places. And they realize that holding both New York and Philadelphia is going to be an impossibility. So in the summer of 78, they evacuate Philadelphia and they march across New Jersey. The Americans are chasing them, bring them to battle at Monmouth Courthouse. It's kind of a stalemate in some respects, but the key for us is that Henry Knox's artillery performed miracles. They stood toe-to-toe with the British, and in fact, they helped the Americans retain the field. And the next morning, after the conflict, the British had decamped in the middle of the night, went back up to Staten Island, and hunkered down into New York. Now, as we fast forward into the fall and we get into the winter, Washington has a conundrum. Normally, you don't fight in the winter in the 18th century. Gentlemen don't do that. It's just not done. But how is he going to send his troops home and get them to come back at the end of the winter? They'll probably all desert, or if their enlistment's up, they won't come back. In addition, if he leaves the field, the British now have access to all of this forage and supplies across New Jersey, and they can run riot with the civilian population. So politically and practically and militarily, the Americans have to stay in the field during the winter. The place that they do that is right around here. This is the theater of war. You can see the British are in New York and Staten Island. The Americans are up in the Hudson Highlands. Think Newburgh, think New Windsor, West Point, controlling that artery. And then they are down below in South Jersey. They've recaptured Philadelphia, or retaken Philadelphia, reoccupied it. And then the main army goes into cantonment, meaning a winter camp at the town of Middlebrook, or the geographical place of Middlebrook. That is down at the lower extremity of the Watchung Mountains. On that relief map, you can see they kind of move down in a fishhook towards Middlebrook, and then they hook back up to the northwest, ending in Pluckeman, right here in Bedminster Township. The main army goes into cantonment in Middlebrook, and the artillery then goes into camp at Pluckeman. Why Pluckeman? Why this area? Well, we're going to hear more about maps shortly. I'm not going to linger on this, but right here we have Middlebrook, and you have Pluckeman behind it. And John Hill, a British officer here, has recorded all of these roads. And we've got spy correspondence that talks about the quality of these roads. They were absolutely essential to the artillery and to the movement of ordnance and other supplies. That is why they chose this place. And for the artillery, they're also behind the main lines of the American army and therefore safer. What do they do once they arrive there? They got to work immediately. They built barracks. This is unheard of. They built barracks, and they talk about barracks, not log cabins, not huts in the parlance of the 18th century, but real barracks. At least we believe they did. They set up workshops. Knox not only had 22 companies of artillery with him at Pluckeman, he had two companies of artificers. These are craftsmen, blacksmiths, farriers, shoemakers, potentially masons, coopers, all of the various skills that you need, the mechanical arts that you need to keep an army supplied, in repair, and in the field. And in addition, he had a company of Continental armorers. These are gunsmiths. So they're repairing weapons and manufacturing weapons. He had a tinsmith there, and tin is a very, very important thing in the American Army because of the absence of some other materials. And if you come back to the Vanderveer House this afternoon, I'll show you some of that, and we can talk about why that is the case. So they embarked on a major undertaking. They had laboratories, as they called them, where they were manufacturing and repairing munitions, cartridges for muskets, as well as rounds for artillery. You'll see that later on over at the Vanderveer House as well. They were bringing in shot and shell. In addition, the field arm of the military stores department was headquartered at Pluckerman under Knox's direction. And so supplies were coming in from around the 13 states, being stockpiled in warehouses right here in Bedminster, in Pluckerman, and then shipped out to the Army as they were needed in the spring and in the summer. An incredibly busy place, an incredibly ambitious undertaking. Now, it is rare to find a drawing of an American campsite during the American Revolution. There are only 3 known drawings of winter campsites for the Americans. This one happens to be of Pluckerman, and at the time we started our work, it had gone missing. There was a description of it from the 1930s, but it had vanished from the National Park Service's files. It's a long story of how we retrieved it, but after we had been in the field for a year, this came to light. And it is remarkable. This is a drawing titled A Southwest Perspective View of the Artillery Barracks, Pluckerman, New Jersey, 1779, and it's labeled Winter at the top. And in the bottom there, it is signed by a guy named John Lilly, J. Lilly Feckett. John Lilly made it. John Lilly was the commander of the 12th Company of the 3rd Continental Artillery. We know he was at Pluckerman. We've got his pay receipts. He drew this thing. And look at the wealth of detail in there. It's absolutely remarkable. So it's very rare to see these things, and we were pleased because it lent some credibility to the work that we had already done in trying to map the site. So this kind of schematic that you see in the upper left there is a field survey that we did in the summer, I'm going to betray my age here, of 1979. 1779, I'd be very old, 1979. And in 1979, we noticed that at the foot of the hill, which is at the top of that screen, the steep slope, at the foot of that steep slope, there were a whole series of rock mounds, piles of stone. Now, this could be a farmer taking stone out of a field as he plows it and piling it out of the way. Or I thought these could be chimney mounds. So after buildings are abandoned, the wood goes away or is torn down, these chimneys eventually collapse and they leave a pile of stone. And sure enough, later on, when we dug underneath these, we did find hearths, fireplaces. But John Lilly's drawing, if you take a look at the building that is right here, and it's too far away for many of you, but there are 13 chimneys in that building. There are 13 stone mounds right here. We mapped a long building right here. You've got a long building there. John Lilly shows a building uphill with 2 chimneys. That corresponds to a building that was up on a little terrace or bench on the slope. We found a random scatter of of mounds there. Those probably represent these huts. And then he shows a long barracks here, which I believe we're seeing the beginning of right there. Nothing in there, and that was not a surprise because that had been plowed in the 19th century and early 20th century. So any of the surface remains were gone. And unfortunately, that is where some of these buildings would have been. Now, to correlate this with a historical record, the most obvious building is this grand structure in the center with a cupola on top of it and a weather vane. That has got to be the Academy. So there are descriptions of a French Alliance ball held here in February of 1779. The officers put on a magnificent affair, and there are descriptions of the Academy being 30 by 50 feet with an arched and plastered ceiling with pane glass. We've got the invoices for pane glass with a cupola on top of it. That is where instruction would be undertaken for officers. We know that adjacent to it were orderly rooms and headquarters buildings. That's probably this. We know that 7 companies of Lamb's artillery went into a long barrack structure adjacent to the Academy, and there are 7 doors and chimneys right there. And then there are 15 rooms that run down in this direction, which was the first line of barracks for 15 companies of artillery. This matches up. The other thing we've got is down here, we've got a guardhouse. That's typical of these sites. And then we have parade grounds on either side. We don't know what these are initially. I was under the assumption that they would likely be workshops. You'd probably put them downwind. And then we've got a long building on the far right-hand side there with no chimneys on it. That's probably warehouses. You don't need to heat them. So why build a fireplace? Why build a chimney? So I think that's what we are looking at. And our subsequent work, I think, has demonstrated that that is probably true. One of the astonishing things to me as an archaeologist is that on this site, when I first walked it, Artifacts were everywhere. Oyster shell, nails, a complete British bayonet, pottery. The surface was littered. And I had to ask myself why. Well, it is a slope. And if you were going to build a building on a slope, what they did was to dig back into the hillside. They pulled that excavated dirt forward and created a level platform, little retaining wall in front there where that orange is. The building then goes up on top of it. Many of the floors would have just been of earth, not wood necessarily. There were a couple of exceptions. And then when the buildings are either torn down or abandoned, they deteriorate, and nature and gravity work to reduce the hill back to almost its original contours. But you've got the backs of rooms maybe being filled in by some of that eroded material. The front of that bench eroded away, and the artifacts moved downhill a little bit. But the center, right where those floors were, it's right under the leaf litter. That's why we were seeing so many artifacts. So if you think about archaeology as digging, you're going to be disappointed on a site like this. We had to take into account the fact that much of the evidence was right on the surface. And so what we did was to go along on our hands and knees, meter square by meter square, after we had laid out a grid, remove all the vegetation and plot the location of every artifact that we could recover. Some we just plotted by where they were within a meter square. Some we did actual, pinpoint locations. It's hard to see on that left image, but that rocky area just to the right of, I think that was Leslie Beadle there, is part of the retaining wall, which had eroded away. She is then kneeling on the bench inside the building. And you might be able to see some light red dots all around her, and they extend all the way up and under that vegetation. That's the front wall. And those are all the nails that fell out of that front wall. Really pretty astonishing to me as an archaeologist to see that. We recorded all of that, and it told us some amazing things. So if we start right here, just to illustrate this by going through a few of these, right here, the ground was just covered with charcoal and clinker from a forge operation, as well as waste material like you see right there. If we go to the next room, right beside it, you get gun parts. This was a gunsmith's or an armorer's shop. If we go a little bit to the left of it, what we find are all tin fragments. Nothing else, literally nothing else. No food remains, no pottery, no glass, nothing, just tin. And we know there were tinsmiths there. And then if we move a little bit further left in that building, I don't know how we make this go away. We were finding pottery. We found civilian buttons. And then over where the officers are, assuming that's officers, I think it makes the most sense, we had Chinese export porcelain. 900 fragments of Chinese export porcelain mixed with wine glasses, oyster shell. There are journals of officers inviting local ladies to tea. So yes, they were drinking tea, despite the fact that we're at war with England. And they are entertaining. Contrast this for a moment with Valley Forge. Totally different. You would never expect to see this there. You wouldn't expect to see this in the American Army anyway, given what's going on. How do I get rid of that? Do that? No? Well, we'll just keep going here. Okay. So, and then if we move in here, we got mostly artifacts that you would associate with enlisted men. Once we started to excavate, then we started to see different things popping up. So in that particular area, the rock actually over this entire site was just mind-boggling. And we had to record the location of all of these rocks because you don't know what's part of a wall or what's just natural fall. And then gradually you remove them and you begin to see patterns like you see on the left-hand side there. The guy on the right is drawing some of these rocks to scale. I had rocks I was seeing them in my dreams at night. But you can see a very rectangular formation there. That is the base of a chimney. The soil on either side, which is a little bit bare, is reddened. It's oxidized. That's from heat. You have a building there with a chimney that has two fireplaces facing in opposite directions. As we excavated more of this, we were able to reconstruct what we think this looks like. So here we start with the chimney, and what we are looking at is two rooms here with one door. So on that lily drawing, wherever you saw a door, if you were to walk through that door, you'd be in an entry or a vestibule, and you could go to the right or to the left, and there would be a squad or a mess group in either side, each with their own hearth. Those buildings were almost certainly of log construction because there were very few nails. And that's in contrast to what we found over here, where I think the artificers and the armorers were quartered. There, our excavations were again kind of mind-blowing. Here you can see that bench that I was talking about with a little bit of a retaining wall still there, a fireplace built back into the hillside with a hearth that actually had a charred log still in place. And wherever you see these white dots, nails were found there. We could outline the rooms, and you got a concentration of nails on either side of the chimney, correct? That's where you've got a stud into which the siding is nailed. That's why all the nails are there. You see them in the corners. This was frame construction, not logs. And in fact, different kinds of nails, such as those you see on the lower right there, to tell us what was going on. Some of them are for framing and siding. Others are for flooring. I'm convinced that this building had a wood floor. We also found glazier's points and fragments of pane glass. They had glass windows, again, very unlike what we've heard for other sites. And then all of this debris from everyday life. Some of it was building hardware, some of it was things that the troops were using on a daily basis. There were more artifacts recovered from that excavation in 1987 or so than had been found in decades of archaeology at Valley Forge by the National Park Service and others across all of their brigades. So not just one room, I'm talking every brigade that they had excavated at Valley Forge. You combine them all, there were more artifacts found here than in Valley Forge in total. What does that tell us again about supply, about a changed set of circumstances a year later? It's remarkably different. So, excavations over on that far end, we were assuming that was a blacksmith shop. We found the forges. That's the base of a forge, believe it or not, that construction of rock that you see in the lower right there, and its dimensions are identical to the Virginia Armory at Colonial Williamsburg, which was built on extant examples and records. And if you don't believe me that that was forge, we had right next to it on the floor left the last day's work of the Smiths, horseshoes and nail stock that they just discarded, and they walked off the site. And it's identical to the debris that we see in working shops, working blacksmith shops like that at Colonial Williamsburg. I did a fellowship there a couple of years ago, learned some remarkable stuff, which we can talk about back at the Vanderveer House, perhaps, if you come over. We located 6 different forges, 3 for sure. The location of another 3 were reasonably certain. It speaks to the volume of work that is being done at this site. One of the things that was remarkable that came out of that area was this brass piece, and you can see that it's got a cannon engraved on it, and it has an American flag out of the trails, and it is the Stars and Stripes. And we picked this up. We actually found 2 of them, and I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. Stars and Stripes, got to be early. Turns out is actually the first known depiction of the Stars and Stripes, because we know this was made and discarded between December 7th of 1778 and mid-June of 1779, because the troops left then. I think these were discarded for a couple of reasons. And again, if you come back to the house, the originals are there along with some reproductions that have been mounted, and I'll show you why I think they were discarded. So what did Knox do here? I mean, he built barracks for 22 companies of artillery, and then he had housing for officers, for artificers, for gunsmiths, for sutlers who were merchants selling to the army, as well as camp followers. He built the workshops for the skilled craftsmen, a laboratory for making up ammunition, warehouses for supplies, an academy where he mandated training for his officers, and then they did a bunch of other training that we're going to get into in a little bit more depth. But they did all of this not just in 6 months. They were only there for 6 months. They built most of it in about 2 to 3 months, and then lived in it for the rest of the winter, and then went on campaign in June, thinking that they would come back. Things didn't quite turn out that way. What is Knox's legacy when we look at this? Well, there are a couple of things that we can look at. Quartering is one, right? Those barracks. Logistics and supply, training and tactics. I think that under him, we see a growth in professionalism in the Army. I truly believe that the roots of the United States Military Academy at West Point can be found in Pluckerman, New Jersey. And I think it's also worth us touching briefly on Knox's life after the military. You know, this is an amazing achievement, but there are a few parallels. This is the old barracks at Trenton. Those are barracks on a sort of a U-shaped plan. We've got kind of a U-shaped plan as well. We know that there was a large barracks in Philadelphia that the British occupied, again, on that U-shaped plan with parade grounds in the center. Recently, archaeologists at Colonial Williamsburg have found the remains of, there we go, the remains of what they are calling, what were called barracks there on that map done by a Frenchman who was with Rochambeau's army when they went down to Yorktown. It looks like individual huts, but we don't know. It had been burned by the British at that point. So we don't know whether it was continuous barracks or not. Knox's installation is kind of unique in some respects, but at its core, it's similar to what the rest of the Army is going to do. So take a look at that long building on the left-hand side there, right? This long building. We think that's about 450 feet long. And we found, oxidized soil and reddened areas, fire-reddened areas all the way down that line and can project it. This is how we think that interior was laid out. This is what I think the profile of it looked like, with bunks on the inside. And again, we think that it was probably log construction, likely whitewashed on the outside with lime to make it look better and for health reasons as well. Imagine this as a series that go downhill, right? They're joined together kind of like that. Here's the problem. Over the course of 450 feet, the length of this building, you drop about 40 feet in elevation. There is no way they built this with a common single roof line all the way down the hill, like Lilly shows. I think that's just artistic convention. It would have taken way too much time for him to get each little zigzag in there. That reconstruction that we've done digitally in the computer on the lower right is what I think this really looked like. I think it was a series of these cabins, each as a sort of a component stepped down the hill. And this is exactly what you see at Middlebrook at the contemporary time periods. One of the things that Washington was adamant about is we are not going to have the illness that we had at Valley Forge. You're not going to dig holes in the ground to save labor, which is going to fill with water and mud in the spring when the rains come. You're not going to lie on the dirt. You're going to be in a bunk up above ground. You're going to dig drainage ditches around your huts, and they are going to be regular. And what they are doing is following a typical plan for a tent encampment, but they're doing it with these log cabins where you have enlisted men down there at the bottom, then you have non-commissioned officers, then commissioned officers, and then field grade officers at the top of the hill, if you will. This is exactly what the American Army starts to do in the field with their quartering. They do it at Middlebrook, and this is the winter after that at Morristown. That is Stark's brigade. That is one of the other, the second of the three drawings we have of an American winter camp. And you can see exactly the same thing there. They have put in place this winter of 78, 79, the new mode of quartering for the American Army. Knox and Washington and Greene and others have figured it out, and this is what they will do throughout the rest of the war. It started here in many ways. This is the third drawing that is known of an American winter camp. This is the so-called Tarbell drawing done of the Windsor Cantonment of 1783. And this is a copy. The original is a little bit harder to make out. It is 7 feet long by 18 inches high, pieced together with different pieces of foolscap or paper. And it shows exactly the same layout. Here's what's interesting, though. Take a look at those buildings. What are they? Well, the ones on the left there are the so-called Temple of Virtue. General William Heath described it as having an arched, plastered interior with 2 rooms at the end. It's almost identical to the description of the academy at Pluckeman. It's got a spire on the top of it. Those are the marks of important public buildings when you see that kind of thing. This is an analog to what was done at Pluckeman. And in addition, there was a little building to the right there. This is a structure put up for fireworks displays, believe it or not, at New Windsor. Now, that French ball, the French Alliance ball they had here at Pluckeman in February of 1779, there are newspaper descriptions of the officers of the Army coming up from Middlebrook with their ladies sometimes, as well as civilians. They go into the academy and they have dinner. They come out of the academy after dinner, and the American officers have erected the facade of a Greek temple with 13 arches. Each arch had a painting inside of it, starting with the conflict with Great Britain through Lexington and Concord, through major battles, all the way to a projected future of peace with a harbor choked with civilian shipping. You know, it was, and then each one of these paintings was illuminated one at a time as a cannon went off. So it was a cannon salute, a 13-gun salute, and each one of them was illuminated then with ground fireworks. That's what they're doing here too, right? So there's this parallel and this analog that runs through the entire experience. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of these logistical things here. Logistics is really complicated. I've spent years trying to figure this out. Knox has a active role in all of it, though. There's a board of war initially made up of congressmen. They get tired of that. They pawn it off on civilians and military. But on the far right-hand side there, Commissary of General of Military Stores, incredibly important for us, and then also the Quartermaster General. Nathaniel Greene became Quartermaster General. He didn't want to do it. He wanted to be a battlefield commander, but he turned out to be brilliant. And Knox was managing the field arm of the Military Stores Department. Look at what they did. These are the records of what was issued out of Pluckerman at the start of the campaign in the summer of 1779. 2,173 muskets, 2,910 bayonets, down to 6,332 cartridge boxes. We know that the average strength of the Army in Middlebrook at that time was 8,700 men, give or take. So that translates into how many of them were being resupplied, what the percentage of resupply was. That is remarkable. That is not the story that we usually hear of poor supply. We have records for shot coming into Pluckerman. Just one furnace, the Mount Hope furnace, delivered 9,000 shot for 3, 6, and 12 pounders and over 76 tons of canister or grape shot, these iron balls that went into a canister that fired out of a cannon like a shotgun shell, anti-personnel stuff. We know that the Pluckerman laboratory filled 156,000 cartridges that then could be issued out to the troops. And they made up blank cartridges, and they manufactured a lot of rounds of artillery ammunition as well. This gives you an idea of what they were issuing to the Army at the end of that winter, almost 900,000 rounds. And again, if you divide that by the active number of troops, we're talking about 102 rounds per man. Really well supplied, perhaps better so than the British were at this point in time. So supply, they started to nail. And we see that through the excavation and the materials that we saw that the officers had, that the artificers had, and that others had. What about tactics and training and professionalism? Well, what they're doing at this point is trying to bring regularity to the American Army. There's a guy who's a Prussian, Friedrich von Steuben, who shows up at Valley Forge. He quickly is embraced by Washington and other officers because although he doesn't speak English, he is a force of nature. And he prescribes a streamlined drill for the American Army. And he, through a combination of swearing and translation from some other American officers who spoke French, he manages to make himself understood. And he drills a model company who will then take that drill to other companies, to other regiments, and it spreads throughout the Army. It then gets codified into what was called the Blue Book. Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States. That was not actually published until the spring of 1779 when we're at Pluckerman. In the meantime, they're trying to train the Army. So at Middlebrook, we find general orders saying, hey, every company, every regiment, send somebody to headquarters to copy down chapters 5 and 6 of the what's going to be the Blue Book, because those are the instructions that you need to train your men in. So that training is going on down at Pluckerman. But how much is in the Blue Book about artillery? One page, right? It's that part of the page on the left and that part of the page on the right. He is leaving it to Knox. Knox has got this under control, and Knox is training his troops at Pluckerman. And what he is doing is requiring them to go into the field and to train that during that winter. Starting in April, when the weather was better, they were out every morning at 9 o'clock to exercise the guns. They had field grade officers, 2 colonels and lieutenant colonels who were there. They were in charge, and they switched off. They alternated. The guns were brought into battle typically by horse. They would practice that. But then once the guns were detached, you use drag lines to maneuver the cannon while the horses are sent to the rear because they're too valuable. You have to practice all of that. That has to be done incredibly swiftly when you're actually in combat. There were other explicit orders for field maneuvers in April. They exercised as regiments for 2 hours every morning, and then they formed into the entire brigade, all 22 companies, in the afternoon, so they could move as a whole. All of that was done to a uniform system of drum signals. This is the importance of drums. Von Steuben gives a bunch of pages to it. Why? Well, because during the course of a normal day, in the absence of clocks, the drums tell a soldier what he is supposed to be doing and where he is supposed to be. And then in battle, that is one of the ways that is reliable to transmit orders, because drums have that low frequency and they boom and they will cut through the gunfire and you can actually hear it. The same thing with fifes, they're at a much higher register. The artillery has a different set of needs, though, than the infantry. And so they instituted a new set of drum signals at Pluckeman, forming a line, advancing the guns all the way down to what we hope we'll never do, which is retreat, but also drilled in priming and loading and practicing according to the signals. So all of this is being done here to bring professionalism. So how does it work? How successful are they? Well, we've seen what happened in Boston. That was a significant victory, and it was won by artillery, putting the British in an untenable position. How about Trenton? That incredible battle, right, which turned the fortunes for the American Army as the year ended in 1776. The Americans executed this complicated maneuver in the middle of the night where two separate units converged on Trenton. And you can see the American units as rectangles there that have a diagonal line through them. But individual artillery pieces are noted right there. Knox was in charge of this. He was in charge of getting the army across the Delaware River. He was in charge of getting the guns to the field. The guns accompanied at the front of the line of infantry, and they set them up so that they would point right down those streets. So when the surprised Hessians came out of their barracks or out of their buildings and tried to form up, they could be swept with canister shot, like big shotgun shells, just cleaning the streets, if you will. And then on this map of the battle, the guns followed, and then eventually, were able to seal off the lines of retreat for the Hessians who surrendered. That's quickly followed up by a battle at Princeton on their way to retaking New Jersey. The artillery was important because the British holed up in Nassau Hall, a brick building, and artillery was the only way to dislodge them. Battle of Monmouth Courthouse, right after the British left Philadelphia, the American artillery went head to head with the British and outgunned them in some respects. This was a mark of a real improvement in the American artillery. And then later on, what we see is an evolution in tactics. Now, this may interest some of you more than others, but it's really kind of fascinating what they actually do. So the British have a system. And what they're doing here is they create brigades of different units as they need them. Right? So they have a kind of ad hoc system here. And as a general sees a need, he assembles a group and puts it together as a brigade, and it goes off. And then maybe some artillery are assigned to it. The Americans didn't do that. The Americans assigned permanent brigades, and then artillery was assigned to each one of those brigades. That is key because they work together as a team. They know each other. They know how to anticipate what the other is going to do. And as the war progressed, they changed their tactics. The British tended to do counter battery fire. So, if our artillerists there in the back have their guns set up, the British are going to try and knock out those guns. Knox and the Americans finally decided it's more important that we kill their infantry soldiers than anything else, and they concentrated on that. And at extreme range, they were skipping balls across the ground. Ideally, they would set up so they could enfilade them or get them from an angle and kill more people, as odd as that sounds. At 400 yards, they then shift to canister shot, which was that anti-personnel ammunition. And this is what it kind of looks like. So here down on the bottom, you've got some brigade guns, and you see that they have been unlimbered. So the limbers have been taken back. The horses have been taken back. These are 6-pounders. The American line is right here. Up here, we've got the British line, that thin red line that you see at the top there. They are about to enter solid shot range at 1,500 yards. When they eventually get down within about 400 yards, the Americans are going to switch to canister shot and try and decimate them so that they just don't make it to the American line. These are the tactics that Americans started using to great effect. And when the war shifted south, which it did after this winter, that's where the British start to put their emphasis. They're just hunkered down in New York, but Cornwallis and others go down to the Carolinas. Knox keeps General Greene supplied when he becomes the commander of the Southern Army after Horatio Gates is defeated a couple of times. But the large distances there and a war of maneuver where they were constantly moving, and frankly, the Americans were running away from the British and trying to draw them out. You needed mobile guns. That's what they were doing. And those dispersed and mobile artillery had to be well trained because they had to act on their own. They didn't have a colonel, a lieutenant colonel, or a major necessarily overseeing them. They had to be able to operate on their own. That's been a hallmark of the American Army ever since. And then they demonstrated their ability in siege warfare in 1781 at that culminating conflict in Yorktown, where the Americans and the French did a rapid march from up north, went down the Chesapeake into Virginia and encircled Cornwallis at Yorktown. The British fleet was kept out of the Chesapeake by the French fleet, and eventually Cornwallis had to surrender. In the course of that, the Americans knocked out virtually every British cannon. They shot 15,000 rounds plus, and that was just from the land-based artillery, not including the ships that were bombarding Yorktown as well. Chastellux with Rochambeau's army was really impressed with the Americans, and he said the British were too. They could not believe how well the Americans acquitted themselves. And in fact, some observers said that they were better artillerists than the French were, which is immense praise. So by the end of the war, the Americans have got a new system down. They're using these light pieces that are attached to infantry. They're mobile, they're maneuverable, and it's a continual evolution. The military academy piece of it, as I think worth talking about too, was Pluckham the nation's first military academy? When I come here, everybody says, of course, right? When I go to other places, they're not so sure. If we follow the thread here, I think you can begin to see what the argument might be. John Adams wrote Henry Knox, this is early in the war, June 2nd of 76, and basically said, I agree with you. We need military academies. Knox has already been talking to Adams in Congress. He's been talking to others as well. We have letters from him to his brother and to various other people talking about the need for an academy. Henry Knox writes to his brother right there, we ought to have academies in which the whole theory of art and war shall be taught. Otherwise, we're just a receptacle for ragamuffins. One of the famous quotes from the war. And then this seminal piece is written in September 27th of 76, Hints for the Improvement of the Artillery. This is where Knox really puts it to paper, and he sends it to Congress. And I can only show you glimpses of it, but he said, we can never act with confidence until we have an academy established on a liberal plan, teaching the theory and practice of fortification and gunnery. And he went on to say that with that, you have to have laboratories, you have to have supply, everything that he did at Pluckham. Because what happened here? He sent this to Congress, Washington agreed with it, and Congress did nothing. Now, in fairness to them, it wasn't just lethargy or inertia, although that played a role. They also were deathly afraid of a standing professional army. They looked back at history and classical history, and they said, this is where the threat to democracy or to liberal government comes from. It comes from a military that is taken over by an autocrat. We don't want to go down that path. So they were very reluctant to do anything that would smack of a professional army. And we paid the price for it. Knox never gave up. Here's what he did at Pluckham, right? And it says there, the academy is to be open on Monday next when Mr. Collis, the preceptor, will attend every day. The officers will attend. They will apply themselves in good earnest. And they were doing it at that academy building. Now, Christopher Collis, that's kind of interesting. Who is this guy? Well, if you look at him in the records, he's listed as a conductor of military stores. It's kind of like a clerk, right? Who's shuffling things in and out of warehouses and making sure that the inventories all tally. Here he's listed by Knox as the preceptor of the park. He is the professor, the instructor of the military academy. But Knox doesn't want to paper that way because he doesn't want Congress to know what he's doing. They learn of it eventually anyway. Collis is an amazing guy. This guy came over from England and Ireland, and he designed the first public water supply system for New York City prior to the war. It was wood. It wasn't built because the war broke out. After the war, he put together the first road atlas of the United States, based in part on his travels with the American Army. He had schemes for canals. He did all kinds of amazing stuff. he was teaching the American artillery. And he was using, among other things, John Muller's Treatise of Artillery. And we know that there was a version published in Philadelphia in 1779 that was dedicated to the officers of the Continental Artillery. That's what they're teaching out of. We have a copy of it back at the Vanderveer House. And as the war ends, this experiment, sort of was a one and done. Knox realizes that we have to continue this, and Washington realizes that at the end of the war, we need a peacetime army. And Congress thinks so too, maybe, and they appoint Alexander Hamilton to examine the question. Hamilton turns to Washington. Washington turns to the officers that you see there. Knox, Duportail, Gouvion, who was a Frenchman, Pickering, Putnam, L'Enfant, who was another Frenchman who came over, and gets their opinions. And I'm not going to show you them all. I just want to give you an idea of what Knox said. It's the same thing. I don't need to read it. He's saying exactly the same thing he said back at the beginning of the war in 1776. We just can't succeed and can't defend ourselves if we don't train officers in a professional way. He also determined that West Point would be the best place for a military academy after the war, this chokehold on the Hudson River, where the Americans had massive fortifications. And that was taken up by others. So Timothy Pickering, important guy, later became adjutant general, quartermaster general, became secretary of war later. He said the same thing. Maybe we need a military school. He was politically astute. He wasn't going to push anything down Congress's throat. But Rufus Putnam, who was Washington's chief engineer at the very beginning of the war, said, yeah, we need it, and it ought to be at West Point. Gouvion and others said the same thing. So Washington put together his recommendations, and he goes on for pages. But he says a regular and standing force for garrisoning West Point is important, and we need academies, one or more, for the instruction of the art military. He laid it all out. And then at the very end of this document, he reiterates it. I cannot conclude without repeating the necessity of the proposed institution. Congress, not so much. They basically said, you can learn it in the field. We don't need to do this. It's not worth the expense. Never mind that the officers who came from France, who were such great service to us, had been formally trained in military academies, which is where we got a lot of this, but they didn't do anything. Ironically, Knox continues this. He becomes Secretary of War. He puts together a plan where, again, he hits on the academy idea, and patience does sometimes pay off, because finally, in 1801, Jefferson was president. He had been an opponent of this all before, and for a variety of complicated reasons, he caves. And he decides, yes, we do need a military academy. And it opens on July 4th in 1802 at West Point, and that is the origin of the U.S. Military Academy. Was Pluckham the nation's first military academy, the first West Point? Yeah, I'm convinced it absolutely was. I mean, he was the first guy to be a vocal proponent for it, and he never quit. I mean, through the war, and then as Washington's Secretary of War, Washington agreed, but was wary of this balance of civilian and military power. Congress just wouldn't act because of their fears. But Knox did it. He required people to be there. He created the model. He showed that it worked. And the success of the American artillery and engineers throughout the war really put the coda on that, I think, in many ways. As for Knox himself, just very quickly, think about what this guy did. He pushed for all of those things that we need: heavy industry, foundries, gunpowder manufacturing, and so on. And we had to build it from scratch. And this guy was a major energy force behind the development of all of these necessary things. Biographers call him this amazingly versatile character, and he was involved in basically every facet of what the Army did. I think his larger legacy is that he was not just an artillerist, he was a brilliant strategist. Washington relied on him a lot. He became a leading political figure after the war, had influence with Congress. He eventually became Secretary of War. He was also incredibly sympathetic to the plight of Native Americans and believed that we should give them reservations and we should then stay off of them and maintain them. And the government should have a role in that. He knew that we needed a strong federal government. Early on, he was prophetic. He said that Articles of Confederation are not going to work. We need a strong federal government. We need the ability to tax. He offered a plan for a constitution. Compare that plan with what we ended up with. There are remarkable similarities. That's how brilliant and how versatile this man was. He oversaw the establishment of the U.S. Navy. He built 44-gun frigates like the Constellation, the Constitution, old Ironsides, which were incredibly important later on and in the War of 1812. They could outgun any British class ship in the frigate class. And he was basically indispensable to Washington. When he finally did step down from public office, he did so in enormous debt. Fortunately, he had these large tracts of forest and land in Maine that had been inherited from his wife's family. And Lucy and Henry went up to the Penobscot Bay and they built Montpelier. This is a reconstruction of the house, which was later destroyed. And then he died on October 25th in 1806 at 56 years of age. You know, just sort of a life cut short, unfortunately. And poor Lucy, not only did she lose 10 kids, then she lost Henry when he had just finally come back from war and public service afterwards and was ready to settle down, you know, for a domestic life. So it's kind of tragic. But I think we have a lot to thank that man for. I think those are legacies of which we should be proud. But what I want to say to you all is that you should be proud and you should take an active role in that pride. How remarkable is it that you have right here in your township that archaeological site, which is still preserved and is only partially excavated and has told us so much about the American experience during the war? How remarkable is it that you have the building in which Henry Knox made his headquarters and brought Lucy and their child to live with him? This is absolutely, you know, amazing to have it. And the Township of Bedminster, the commission, have really wonderful plans that can be an asset to this community and to future generations to understand what transpired here. To build a structure, a reconstructed barn, a historic barn that they have the pieces of, as a repository for artifacts. All of the field records, you can see some of them over at the house this afternoon, have to be housed. There is an incredible library that is being built. This can be a research hub and a teaching hub about the American Revolution. So I want to urge all of you to please support what the commission is doing, what the township is doing, and what your historical societies are doing. Lend a hand however you can, whether it's through your volunteerism, whether it's through, you know, your checkbook, however it might be. We cannot let these stories go. We just can't. And they are not widely known enough, certainly outside of New Jersey. So with that, I thank you very much for being a patient audience and letting us run through all this. Hand it over to Barry.
So
Okay.
it's gonna take about a 5-minute bio break. If
Okay.
that's okay with everybody, and then we'll set up the next presenter. There's some waters in the back and also on the table outside.